G'day YouTube, particularly g'day Gary in Mendham. I've just had a look at your little clip regarding sunfoils. I got about 8 minutes in and I just sort of had to stop watching and send you a comment telling you that I'm making this video. Shot in night mode outside. I don't know why. I've got the bloody generator going to run the hut's lights. Inside there I got the potbelly going and it's nice and warm, but I just sort of feel like sitting outside to talk to you. You made an outside video to me, why not? Look Gary, let's deal with the aerodynamics first. Like you said, motor cars have horrible aerodynamics. In the case of my car, it was pretty easy to build a solar array and streamline it for a particular speed so it could be drag neutral. That was the Mark 1. It was drag neutral at 90 kilometres an hour. Big and clunky though it was a faceted aerofoil, and the downwash from the faceted aerofoil unstalled the trailing edge of the top of the rear window, right? Or the trailing edge of the roof at the top of the rear window. I warn you in advance, I'm a little bit tiddly. It's a Friday night here in Oz. So, okay, with the Mark 1 I was able to get it to be aerodynamically drag neutral at 90 k's. From my fuel burn figures, and Gary, I take my fuel burn figures monthly. I have done empty tank to empty tank, stop on the side of the road and refuel from the can that I carry. But I've found that empty tank recordings, there are variables, mate, variables that don't otherwise apply. Empty tank evaporation rates. When you get a very thin layer of fuel in the bottom of your tank, it's got a huge surface area compared to its volume, and it evaporates much faster than when you've got a quarter or a third or a half or three quarters or a full tank. And yeah, there's a carbon canister to try and trap the hydrocarbons evaporating, but it's got a fixed capacity, and well, I found you can get a difference of 3 kilometres to the litre if you use 5 litres in 1 day versus in 3 days in summertime here in Australia doing empty tank to empty tank recordings. So for the purposes of realism, getting hyper laboratory about it doesn't help much. Now, there's a fella called Karl Cruzilnicki who I mentioned in the movie SunFoil Science, and he's a medical doctor. He's got a PhD in mechanical engineering and he's got a Bachelor of Science in biochemistry. He's the Julius Sumner Miller Professor for Science and Education at Sydney University. And when he tried this trick 30 years ago, putting a solar panel on his car, he claimed to have fitted a randomising switch so that he did not know when the panel was switched on, and he got the bloke at the service station to switch his panel on or off by tossing a coin and writing the result down in a diary. And he reckoned he got no difference at all whatsoever whether his panel was on or off. My Murphy's Law conclusion is that either he claims to have destroyed energy, sunlight hits solar panel, turns into electricity, is fed to the battery via a charger, thus the battery shows its full voltage to the alternator, and here we run into the second major problem you've got, Gary. I have a 1 horsepower output alternator, 50 amps, 750 watts. It does not mean that every time I start the engine the alternator is at that figure. You said, wouldn't it be better if the alternator could be switched off? Gary, it is switched off by a full battery. The alternator's exciter circuit in the rotor, the bit that turns the centre of the alternator into an electromagnet so that the stator windings can pick up the electric current from the electromagnetic field sweeping in a circle through them, that amount of current to the rotor is controlled by the regulator, and the regulator looks at the battery voltage, and if the battery is full, then the alternator is not making any electricity at all whatsoever. The alternator is a turnaround pulley for the water pump. That's all it is, with a centrifugal fan. Right? Now, if you really wanted to get clever about this, Gary, you would look to the Wright turbo compound, which was an 18-cylinder, 2,500 horsepower engine, which was given 3 power recovery turbines, which drove the crankshaft through a reduction gearbox and a hydraulic coupler. And the Wright company sold 9,000 of them from 1952 to 1959, when turbojets put big, efficient piston engines out of business. But by putting 3 power recovery turbines on a 2,500 horsepower engine, they turned it into a 3,500 horsepower engine. It's what the Lockheed Super Constellation was powered by. So if you wanted to get really clever, you would take a rev head sized turbocharger, you would throw away the compressor side, you would use the hot side to run a reduction drive, you would use the reduction drive to run a whippersnipper shaft with an angle drive gearbox on the end of it to a pulley at the front of the engine, and then you would run all the accessories on the exhaust gas, because the exhaust gas has twice the energy of the crankshaft at any power setting. Yeah? You go and have a look at a heat balance diagram and see where the energy goes in, I don't know, something like a Rolls-Royce Merlin. Right? To get 1,600 horsepower out of the crankshaft, you need 5,400 horsepower going into the carburettor in terms of the energy in the fuel. Right? There is no reason to run the alternator at all on the crankshaft. It should be running on the exhaust gas. To those who say, oh, but what about the turbocharger? I say, here in Australia there are no mountains over 10,000 feet. If there's no mountains over 10,000 feet, you don't need to compress the inlet charge. Right? If you really want to run a compressed inlet, run a gear-driven supercharger, save the exhaust gas energy to run the auxiliaries. But in the meantime, I don't have that sort of a workshop, do I, Gary? So what I've done is I've put a solar panel on the roof of the car, and the solar panel, as you said, is 30 watts. 1.7 amps. Now, the battery loses 3.68 amp hours per day, 3.35 amp hours per day, but to recharge 3.35 amp hours, you've got to put 3.68 back in there. And the engine, because it is only 3.25% efficient, burns 207 mils of petrol per amp hour. So there, 3.68 times 207 is your 760 mils per day. 7 days in a week, Gary, 5.33 litres a week. 266 litres a year. Okay? Now when you're talking torque, T-A-L-K-T-O-R-Q-U-E, when you're talking torque, yes, my engine is 60 horsepower, but to drive around the town I'm only using 5 horsepower to push the air out of the way. Yeah? If I've got a 1 horsepower alternator at 25% output to feed a 25% flat battery, because my average engine run time is 6 minutes, and the voltage dominant regulator on the alternator is going to take 45 minutes to finish charging the battery, so when I drive from the post office out here and it takes 15 minutes, as I switch the engine off, the battery has not been fully charged to make up for all the engine starts in town, the little short 1 minute, 2 minute, 3 minute runs. So my battery goes to bed, or sits there and waits for the next time I start the engine, and it's in a part discharge state, and then it commences to sulfate while it feeds the dashboard clock and the stereo memory chip. Right? That is why every day the car sits in the car park, it adds 760 mil to the fuel burn next time you switch the engine on. You switch the engine on, you hit the battery with 98 amps for 2 seconds to start the engine, and that's an average figure. Initially 630 amps, right, to start a loaded electric motor against a reduction gear against a petrol engine that's cold. Average 98 amps for 2 seconds. Right? That's a 20th of an amp hour. I can start the engine 19, 20 times on 1 amp hour. So 3.68 amp hours times 20. You go out there and start a car engine that much. That's the kind of energy we're talking per day. And it's electricity that the battery wants. It doesn't care how much fuel you have to burn to make the torque to drive the crankshaft, to turn the belt, to run the step-up ratio, to run the alternator. The battery wants electricity, and if you feed it solar electricity, then when you start the engine, you don't have to run another 2 horsepower on top of the 5 horsepower to drive around the town. Now 2 as a fraction of 5 is 40%, Gary. And if I had a more modern electrical system with a 3-to-1 step-up ratio and a bigger alternator, then I might be putting 7 horsepower into the belt, 5 horsepower into the gearbox to drive around the town. Out there on the highway, I'm only using 25 horsepower to push the air out of the way and 1/3 of a horsepower for the bearings. So if I'm putting another 2 horsepower into the belt to drive the alternator to service the 25% flat battery, which I'm not going to finish charging by the time I get home, yeah, I accumulate a charge deficit in the battery which allows it such a low voltage it can suck hard enough on the alternator that it stabilises. And batteries are designed to live in that condition for 2 years in a car. But if you put the same battery in a house and feed it with solar panels and run the house on it, lead acid battery lasts for 10 years. I mean, I've been at this shit for 20 fucking years before I put a solar panel on a car, Gary. Turning motor car alternators with wind turbines and step-up ratios. And I know what happens when you connect a spinning windmill driving an alternator to a flat battery. The fucking windmill stops. And it stops because an alternator is an electromagnetic drag brake. And the strength of the drag brake varies in proportion to the flatness of the battery. So unless you want an electromagnetic drag brake at the front of your engine, you put a solar panel on the roof. Now, if you listen to what I said, when you stick a solar panel on a car, the panel is going to reduce the car's fuel burn by about 25%. If you make the panel drag neutral, that's about the fuel burn reduction I think you can expect. If you really pull your finger out of your arse to the elbow joint or beyond, and you set your solar panel up so that it becomes an aerofoil, and you set the downwash up in a place that it's going to improve the aerodynamics of the car, then that 25% might come up around the 30% mark. If you're a little old lady and you live in town and you only ever drive at 50 k's and you drive the car twice a week, once to the supermarket and once to the church, and if your neighbours are used to laughing at you as you kangaroo hop up the road because they think you've forgotten how to drive, I think when you put a solar panel on the roof and your battery is full, you're going to have enough torque to drive the alternator as well as the gearbox, and you won't kangaroo hop any no more. And I think I've been at this for years, and I still think you're an armchair critic, and possibly you agree with me and you keep asking dumb questions because you know you've got such a big following that both your likers and your haters will come and have a look to see what it is that you're talking about. That's my current theory, because I know you're not stupid, Gary. And I've tried having a panel that you plug in when the car is stopped, and it's a pain in the arse. It's so much easier to have a slightly larger panel on the roof of the car and leave it there. Thanks for your interest. Ciao.